Well, if a footballer scores 5 goals in a season, is that a good return or is that a bad return? Of course, the answer is it depends, doesn't it? It depends on a variety of factors. But one of the most important factors that it's dependent upon is what position does this footballer play? If they're a centre back, 5 goals in a season is pretty impressive. But if the footballer is a striker and their primary role in the team is to score goals, then you could argue that 5 in a season isn't actually that impressive. When it comes to scoring goals, these two types of players should be judged by totally different standards. And that principle is true, Paul says, in life. We can't judge everyone by the same standard because not everyone, Paul says here, professes to be a Christian. You might remember what's been happening in this chapter of 1 Corinthians. Paul has called on the believers in Corinth to judge a man who professes faith in Christ and is claiming membership in the church, yet simultaneously he's living in unrepentant sin. And so Paul called on the believers to Corinth to remove this man from among them. But Paul doesn't want these Corinthian believers to get confused about the issue of making judgments. While we are called to hold professing Christians to account for their behaviour, we are not called to pass judgment on the conduct of those in the outside world. Why? Because Paul says here, that's not our job, that's God's job. Read with me from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through to 12. It says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. It appears from this passage that Paul's actually written a previous letter to the Corinthians, one that we don't actually have a record of. But it appears that having read that first letter, these Corinthian believers have become a little bit confused. It clearly shows here that in that first letter, the Apostle Paul warned the Corinthian believers and told them not to associate with the sexually immoral. And I'm sure you can imagine the confusion and maybe even the outrage that some of the Corinthian believers might have had upon hearing this command from Paul, not to associate with the sexually immoral. They probably said things like this, that's not what Jesus would do. Jesus hung out with the sinners and the rebels and the immoral of society. He hung out with the tax collector. I mean, how are we meant to witness to an outside world if we can't associate with them? And so Paul's saying here in verse 10, no, don't misunderstand me. And in verse 11, he goes to clarify what he really means. He says, what I'm saying is this, don't associate with anyone who lives this sort of lifestyle, yet claims to be a believer and claims allegiance to the local church. Or as Paul puts it here, someone who bears the name brother. Paul says, do not affirm that sort of behavior among God's people. When you do, you totally discredit the gospel. Again, you might think this is quite harsh, just to totally cast off people like that. Is that what we're being called to do? Well, not exactly. Again, it's important to remember that Paul is writing this letter to the church of Corinth. He's not writing this letter and giving this command to an individual per se. He's writing it to the church collective. So what Paul's not saying is this, no member in the church can check up on an individual like this. No member in the church can send a text message or pay a visit to the sexually immoral among you. No, what Paul is saying is this, be careful that this individual who's bringing and making a mockery of the gospel, make sure that they're not associated by public perception with your church, your community. Because that is a terrible witness to the outside world, and as we saw yesterday, it will even do you great damage. But secondly, Paul wants to remind these Corinthians in verse 12 to 13 that while they should hold those who profess faith among them to account, they actually have no business passing judgment on the outside world. God has not called you to be the judge of the world, Paul says. God is the only judge. And God is a good, fair, and righteous judge. So leave the judge's work to the ultimate judge, God himself. Here's your challenge for today. Firstly, pray for your church and its leadership that God would give them wisdom in holding their own to account and protecting the witness of the church. These issues in practice are always difficult and can often feel divisive. But secondly, identify times in your own life where you're perhaps tempted to pass judgment on the outside world. And then remind yourself and be comforted by the Apostle Paul's words here. God is the only judge. Hope you have a good day.